saying welcome from me. I'm Conor McCormick, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Human Rights Centre in the School of Law here at Queen's University, Belfast. And I want to just welcome you to the final session in this year's postgraduate symposium on emerging issues in human trafficking research, which we're hosting as the Human Rights Centre, but which has been organised entirely by postgraduate students based here in our school, but in collaboration with postgraduate researchers from Queen Mary University of London and the University of Salford. So it's been a trilateral organisation in terms of the preparation for today. Some of you may have seen the presentations by those students previously, either yesterday or earlier this afternoon, but we're now moving on to the final keynote presentation of the symposium. Before I introduce the speaker, could I just ask you to follow the usual protocols when it comes to Microsoft Teams? In other words, turn your videos off. I see everybody's is off for the time being. Keep your videos off and keep your microphones on mute. And if you have any questions as the lecture is being presented, please put them in the chat bar. I will channel those through to the presenter at the end. But I would ask you to keep your questions, if you do have them, short, because it can get a bit cumbersome if people write essays in the chat bar. So that brings me to my introduction. We have the pleasure of Dr. Rosemary Broad's company for the purposes of this keynote. Those of you who have been in attendance at previous parts of the symposium will be no stranger to Dr. Broad, who was not only kind enough to give us this presentation you're about to hear, but also acted as a discussant at one of the earlier panels. And we're enormously grateful to her for doing all that for us. Dr. Broad is a lecturer, a senior lecturer, I spy from her Twitter profile, but perhaps not on her institutional profile just yet. Senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Manchester, with her main research interests being, as I understand them, human trafficking and modern slavery. I'm really looking forward to hearing her criminological perspective on the themes that have been explored throughout the past 2 days. So I'm going to stop speaking and pass the floor over. Dr. Broad.
Hi everybody, thank you very much, Conor. Thank you for that introduction. I am a senior lecturer, thank you. It should be somewhere on the profile. I will just hopefully share my slides in a seamless way. Right, can people see that?
Yes, that's working for me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm Rose Broad, from the University of Manchester. Thank you for inviting me to speak and to be involved in the symposium. It's great to see so many early career researchers undertaking such interesting and varied research in this area. And I think I was looking at one of the chats and someone had mentioned interdisciplinarity, and Conor, you obviously in human rights and law, and I'm coming from a criminological perspective. And something that I found is just the range of disciplines that are involved in this it seems to spread all the time, and it makes it so interesting and very complex, but a really interesting area to engage with. There were some great presentations in the session I was involved in earlier, drawing on all kinds of different themes around things that have emerged in my own research over the years, and it's really great to see these things emerging in other people's research as well. So in this address, I want to talk a little bit about my experiences of conducting research in this area for around about 12 years now, and what progress and challenges I've seen in that time. And then I want to move on to the project that I'm involved in now, and then think a little bit about what the future might hold, as the theme of the conference is about these kinds of emerging issues and the future trafficking research, obviously including the contributions that many of you will make to the field in coming years as your research progresses. Excuse me. So I came to academia a little bit later on in my life. I worked in various criminal justice institutions prior to starting my PhD. I have a story about going to Sheffield as part of my experience of trying to gain access to data, which I'm sure many of you have come across all kinds of barriers and obstacles, and it was no different 12 years ago when I was trying to negotiate access to my data. So at the time, at the time of this meeting that I'm talking about, I was 8 months pregnant, and I was a woman at a meeting with all the rest, everybody else that was there was a man, and they were significantly older than I was. And I was 8 months pregnant. I was big, and so clearly I was obviously pregnant, and I was an early career person, as opposed to these established people that were in an official organisation, a gatekeeper organisation that I had arranged this meeting with my supervisor to try and negotiate access. So we got to this meeting, and I spent the whole meeting with the men from the organisation talking to my supervisor, and he was doing his best to try and redirect the conversation to me, but they would answer him and I would ask another question, and then it would go back and they would answer him again. And it was just a really kind of interesting and awful gender dynamic at the time. They said to me, I said, I'm interested in perpetrators of modern slavery. I want to understand more about their pathways into offending. And the man said, we already know everything. In 2008, he already knew everything, and they weren't interested in engagement from academia in their data, which, you know, as we know, is an interesting perspective for somebody to have at any point, especially so early on in the development of the field. During the PhD research, I was looking for experts to interview, and I know some of you have done interviews with experts as well. And I was interested in people in the police and in the criminal justice system and in the Crown Prosecution Service. At the time, there were only 4 out of the 43 police areas who had specialist units. So it was a completely different landscape to that which we have now. Coming across specialist units and even NGOs that specialised in this area was really difficult to come by. I did manage to carry out interviews with experts who had quite a lot of experience, and it seemed to be that because they had experience, they quickly became renowned in their areas, so they became very experienced. But a project that I was recently involved with, we did a review of the registered charity database, and there were, on the count that we did, over 230 NGOs registered with an interest in modern slavery. So a completely different context now. Almost everything that was discussed at the time related to sexual exploitation and with female victims, and taking the thread of gender forward into that. A thread that emerged from my PhD was about the levels of convictions of women. Around 1/3 of women in the data that I had, which was probation data, were female. Sorry, 1/3 of the people that were convicted were female, which is the same as I'm sure some of you will have seen in the UNODC data and in other countries as well. And we still have that pattern now. But it's an interesting pattern to identify, because if you look at any other criminal offence, women don't feature as highly in almost any type of crime. And I think that question hasn't really been addressed about why we see these levels of conviction. And so that's followed through into some of the research that I've done since then. During my PhD, which took 5 years to complete because I had 2 years leave, separate leave of maternity leave. So I had 2 children, which not a route that I would recommend, but finally got there after that amount of time. And towards the end, there started to be talk of the Modern Slavery Bill, and that then became the Act, which was the scenario that any postgraduate researcher dreads, you know, a huge change in the field, a large scale change in the field just at the time of the Viva. So I was frantically trying to read up on everything to do with it, anticipating these questions for the Viva. Fortunately, it didn't scupper the end of my PhD, and it was really interesting to see the culmination of conversations that I had been following with some of the experts that I had interviewed, coming to fruition in various ways and in various reports. At the same time, I was going to international conferences when we were allowed to leave the house in mainland Europe, and I was talking to some scholars from other universities after a presentation, and someone asked me, why the change in terminology? Why have we moved from human trafficking to modern slavery? What was the problem with human trafficking, and why the change in terminology to something that's quite emotive? I had been interested throughout my PhD on the policy changes in this area, about problematization. And I'd done some work on this with a colleague, Nick Turnbull, who's in politics at the University of Manchester. Why things get defined as problems, why things get defined in particular ways. And this added another layer to my research, I think, and drew me towards questioning the policy change and what that was about. And pertinent to my research, I think, has the change in policy, has the change, all this change in the Act that has been done, has it made any difference to the types of people that had been convicted, particularly around female offenders? Are there organised criminals being convicted, or are they still often these low-level, not particularly sophisticated and not particularly well-off types of people that I had seen early on being convicted? 4 of the interviews in the current project that I'm involved with, sorry, I'll talk about the project first before I mention that. So the current projects that I wanted to talk about, and I will talk about a little bit more. So one of the projects is an ESRC funded project where we're looking at pathways into modern slavery, conducting interviews with people convicted for modern slavery offences in prison and in the community. Which has been really interesting, and I'm going to talk through some case studies from that shortly. But picking up on the gender point that I made before, 4 of the interviews that I've carried out with women in this project have been in a mother and baby unit of the prison that I'm working with, which again has led me to question the sentencing of these people and the risk that they pose. Do they pose enough risk to be confined with their babies in prison, and how this is being viewed during sentencing? At the same time, the women's prison that I'm working with has asked me to conduct some interviews with women who are victims of trafficking, but they're in prison for another offence. And I've undertaken 5 such interviews with women who are all foreign nationals who have been convicted for immigration-related offences and are in prison, but have been victims of modern slavery. I've had subsequent conversations with local authority, police and NGOs about these women who are really lost in the system and where their needs as victims are not being met. The other project that I'm involved in at the moment is a review of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Modern Slavery programme. Sorry, I had some feedback from someone's microphone. Sorry. I'll be conducting interviews with parliamentarians in Commonwealth countries virtually, of course, and I'm hoping it will provide an insight at the other end of the spectrum. So on the one side, I've got these interviews with people convicted for modern slavery, and on the other side, the people who shape law and policy that result in those people at the other end. So that's just a quick overview of my experience and where I am just now. So the current project that I'm involved in that I wanted to talk a little bit about is aimed at understanding more about people who are convicted for modern slavery, using a combination of methods to produce a model, and I'll show you a little bit where we are with that in a little bit, about people's personal and social histories that contribute to the organisation of modern slavery. We're conducting biographical narrative interviews, and I'm working with David Gadd, if any of you know him, and he is an expert in these biographical narrative interviews, and it's been fantastic working with him to really think about some of this conflict between modern slavery and immigration policy, which some people talked about in the presentations this afternoon, which was really interesting. So we've conducted 28 interviews to date, 9 women and 19 men, which again goes back to that gender split that I talked about before. 15 from the UK and the remaining participants from all kinds of different places. The average age of participants is 40, which if you think about any other type of crime is quite old. If we looked at the average age for most other types of offences, it would be a lot younger. For something that is generally classed as an organised crime, we would expect to see this older average age, where people need some kind of network or some kind of legitimate business going on to get involved in the modern slavery in the first place. So I'll talk about some of the people that we've interviewed and some of the things that have arisen so far. So this is Adam. He was a Hungarian man. He was the first person that we interviewed in the project. This was the first story that I heard. He was in his 20s. He was covered in tattoos. I interviewed him in prison, and he was convicted with his family for trafficking for sexual exploitation under the previous legislation. He grew up in Hungary with his father as a member of the Hungarian mafia, who introduced him to drug taking and drug dealing as a 13-year-old. He said to me, my life was normal. I grew up normal, you know, taking crack with my parents. His drug use continued and he lost his first love. And at that point, his mental health deteriorated and he migrated to the UK to join his parents. He then met Jenny, who fell in love with him, despite him telling her that he would never love her and that she was just using his family. She had been abused as a child and actually trafficked by another family. Adam maintained that he rescued her from this family and she came willingly with him. She then worked for him as a pimp along with several other women, and he spent his earnings on drugs, clothes and cars, despite not being able to drive. Jenny eventually grasped on the family, the bits in quotes are his words, although the other women involved refused to make a complaint. He pled guilty to the sex trafficking, but he vehemently denied charges of rape that were brought, and he wasn't convicted of those. In terms of the things that we see, I think Adam fits this kind of dominant narrative that we often see around sex traffickers. But like a lot of people that you speak to, when you start to think about his early life and the way that he got into this, there weren't a lot of options open to him with his mafia family and the kinds of experiences he had as a young person. Grace was a Kenyan woman in her 40s convicted for trafficking for sexual exploitation. She had travelled to Ireland in her late teens as a domestic worker. She'd met an Irish woman in Kenya who had promised that she would pay for her to go to college, and then Grace could send money home to her family in Kenya who were struggling financially. However, when she got there, she wasn't allowed to leave the house. She didn't get to go to college. She never got paid and she was mistreated. She was physically and sexually abused in the home. She escaped from there with some help from a friend of the family who had a contact in London who she put Grace in touch with. She got to London and worked in a brothel as a receptionist, not wanting to be involved in sex work, but then later, to make more money, became a sex worker. She later opened her own brothel as well as a hair and beauty salon. She bought a house in London for £1.7 million, which was taken off her following the police raid. She had a raid at her brothel, and many women were found in the brothel, some of which were trafficked. She was the only person convicted. No men or other people were convicted. I think this is a fairly representative of several of the women that I spoke to who had got into trafficking for sexual exploitation, having experienced sexual victimization and domestic servitude, different types of exploitation prior, and had intervention happened at that point, I think there would have been an opportunity to help them at that point, and that perhaps these situations wouldn't have happened. The last example I wanted to talk about is Hina. She's convicted for labour exploitation. She's in her 30s. She's a British woman, and her parents were Pakistani and had migrated prior to her being born. She worked all her life as a professional person, never had been in trouble before. She is a qualified legal executive and worked in immigration law. Her interest in it was sparked after some horrific experiences of forced marriage as a teenager. She later left the abusive relationship and had to register for insolvency from her husband's debts. And she then started a tailoring business, and she saw an opportunity to make Pakistani and Indian clothes, bring them to the UK and sell them in the UK instead of people having to pay for them to be imported. So she arranged the travel for the tailors and the work in her legal executive role and applied for visas through the Home Office. She maintained that she wanted to do everything right. She paid for some of their travel and then deducted this from their pay after they were working. Some of the tailors became unhappy with their situation, and so wanting more money, they started to make clothes directly for people instead of going through Hina's business. When she discovered this, she said to them, "Your visa depends on you working for me. If you make clothes directly for them, you'll be breaching the immigration rules and you might be deported." So they then sought some legal advice and were told that this fits the definition of modern slavery, and this was what she was convicted for. Now, obviously, all of these have a story to tell that is their story. And in the analysis, we are very keen to pick up on reasons that they might want to justify their behaviour. So I'm very aware that these are their kinds of stories. I think their stories are very important, though, in giving a voice to people that have got into this kind of activity. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're starting to put them together into groups. So this is an early kind of a model of where we are in terms of thinking about perpetrator involvement. So on the one hand, on the right hand side, we have vulnerable and marginalised people who've been prior victims who get into perpetration of the offences almost through their victimisation or as a way to escape that. On the other side of that, we have quite organised people, more sophisticated people, still perhaps with underlying reasons why they got there. It's not to justify those reasons, but I think we need to identify those reasons if we're going to think about how successful interventions will work. And then in the middle, there are these groups of people who are struggling entrepreneurs like Hina, and then some other people who I haven't included an example of here, but this group of people are kind of people who are asked to do something that are perhaps not that clever, who get caught, but you suspect that there's another layer of people behind that who manage to get them to do the running around and cross the borders and get caught while they manage to escape. And all of this is taking place with these external pressures of business, community, remittances to family, financial pressure, and religion. All of this driven by often migration and a lack of work or stability in countries of origin. So, as many of you have identified in the course of your own research and just looking at the programme from the last couple of days, human trafficking is so broad and complex and multifaceted and interdisciplinary and really interesting. when I started thinking about the emerging challenges and where future research may lie, I think there are so many potential areas. And as with anything in this topic, the more I think about it, the more there is to think about and the more complex it becomes. So the ones I've chosen are by no means what I see as the most important, but they are those that have arisen from my experience and my research. But there are a huge number of other emerging issues as well. I think working with people who are serving sentences, as I used to do before coming into academia, and trying to develop support for those people, for offenders, I'm a bit loath to call them that, but it's never something that's met with very much empathy or compassion, and it's not something that people want to put resources into. However, I think it's crucial to engage with those people who are held responsible for these activities, to understand how they got there, and for some of them, how they could have been diverted from doing so. For some people, that is difficult and often a seemingly impossible task, for people who are very entrenched in criminality and perhaps grew up in a criminal family. But for other people, there is clear potential to identify and support those people whose pathway has been through victimisation or circumstances where, had they been adequately able to make other choices, they would have. I think there's a challenge around the numbers of women involved in these offences that is global and persistent. Understanding more about the criminal networks that are needed to facilitate these activities would perhaps allow a better understanding of why this is the case and how it can be addressed. This is also the case for some of the men that we've interviewed in the project who have, like the women, had a role in the criminal enterprise, but there are others who, because of their roles, remain out of the picture and therefore out of prosecution for various reasons. And finally, there are challenges in the tensions between policy frameworks for migration and those for modern slavery and human trafficking. It's easy to criticise these frameworks and find fault with policy that restricts opportunities for people to travel and work to such an extent that they have few other options than to seek travel or work through people who seem to be able to facilitate it through the only means that they have. However, it's more difficult to identify ways of balancing these policy areas. But we have to try to understand more about these dynamics, and I think to try and address some of these difficult questions. And I struggle with it myself. I was asked by an MP during an interview lately, what do you think we should do? And it's easy to say, well, what you're doing is no good. But when somebody says, how can we do it better? That's when I think it's difficult. But if we understand a bit more about these dynamics, about the choices that people have when they move, and how desperate some people are for travel or work, only then will we be able to make informed contributions to those debates. So thank you again for inviting me, and I think that was only half an hour, which I think was right. But then I noticed that the slot was an hour. I'm sure you don't want to listen to me for an hour. So I'm very happy to answer any questions or have any discussions. I hope my reflections and stories have been useful to you. And as I say, I'm happy to have a chat about it.
Rose, thank you so much.
Okay.
That was really eye-opening for me. As have all the presentations in the symposium been. There is time, as you say, for plenty of questions and discussions, so I would encourage everybody present to start typing if you have any. I suppose while we're waiting, I had a few thoughts, I suppose, as we were going through that I might start us off with. The first thing that struck me was that your research, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I can hear you. Am I still sharing my screen, or have I turned it off?
No, it's off now.
Okay, good. Sorry.
We're good.
Yeah. So
I was going to say, it struck me that what appears to me anyway to be one of the biggest strengths of your overall research agenda or portfolio, whatever you want to call it, is that it's extremely rounded. So you've got those dual perspectives at each side. And the first thing I was wondering was whether that presents any difficulties for you either in gaining or maintaining the trust of your participants on each side? So is there any issues of, I don't want to say bias or allegations of bias, but I suppose the research speaks for itself. So in terms of gaining access and maintaining access to the people you speak to, has it ever thrown up problems? And then whenever you come to write up, have you ever received any reactions to your write up, which touches on those issues? So in other words, it's more one-sided. There's a one-sided approach. That interests me just because with all these areas, there's an expectation, isn't there, for academic impartiality, which I think could be extremely hard to achieve and is difficult or an unfair expectation in some circumstances. That's one thing. Two more, I suppose, just to kind of throw out there while people are thinking. One is, you mentioned the issue of abuse in shelters or homes, which was also brought up in previous presentations throughout the symposium. And I'm wondering, as an outsider, is there any oversight of the kind of system of shelters and homes for persons who've been involved in trafficking? Because that's quite frightening to me, to think that there's no one guarding the guardians, as it were, of people. So I imagine it's partially to do with the extent to which it's publicly supported or funded, because if it's charitable organisations, there's maybe different oversight frameworks in place than there are in state systems. That was the second thing. And then just lastly, I'm really interested in what you had to say about the external pressures that people are under or placed under, and how that leads them to get involved in these sorts of activities. Because I've thought about in other contexts this whole rational agent idea, in other words, that it's perfectly possible to sit and theorize circumstances where it's totally rational for somebody to have gone down that path, given their circumstances, given the pressures they're under. And I was reflecting on how I don't think human rights law really recognizes or captures that. So I suppose it's a question of the extent to which you're strictly liable for doing something which is regarded as an infringement of a human right. But you've really pushed me to think a lot further about whether we need to revisit that sort of thinking, because if we're talking about people, as you've explained, who really we can understand why they were led to get involved in those activities, is there a fair framework for discussing their actions, maybe from the world of criminology, that we could learn about and discuss? So I've talked for far too long, but those are just some jumping off points to kind of start us off.
Okay, thank you. I think the first question that you asked, was that about the role of interviewing, on the one hand, people in prison, and on the other hand, policymakers? That
Exactly.
kind of, yeah, okay. Yeah, and the Parliament project is new to me, and I have done this work with my colleague in politics, and I've been talking to him about approaching this and kind of the best way to engage with parliamentarians and people in those kind of roles. And I am quite, I don't know, I mean, having spent such a long time in prisons and talking to people on probation, I'm much happier there. Now I'm talking to parliamentarians, I feel like they're not going to tell me the truth, which is an interesting kind of a thing to think about. I'm like, oh, well, the people in prison are okay, but I don't trust you, you know, that I need to be really reflective, I think, about the way that I'm going into it. I haven't done any interviews yet. We've just got the ethical approval to do them. However, I think one of the things that's really interesting in all of this, and it's an uncomfortable balance, I think, is partly around the development of the modern slavery agenda, and also through things like having a Commonwealth association where we help countries that we enslaved in the past with their modern slavery legislation. I mean, the irony in that is, you know, just multifaceted. Also, I think, you know, we're going to go out and help other people with their legislation when actually we have all kinds of problems. It's not like we've sorted it, I think. So I feel a kind of, when I'm talking to them, what do you think about the help that you received? It's interesting because are we saying that we're doing everything right? And I need to make sure that I'm really independent in that, away from, you know, I'm not involved in Parliament, and I'm a researcher, but I think there always is that tension when you're working with an organisation, whether it's the police or a prison or anything, that the people see you as independent, but also you need to maintain that relationship with whoever, whatever institution it is, because ultimately, generally, the people that are helping you are very well-meaning and want to help, and perhaps you can helpfully identify some of those tensions to them. Hopefully that's kind of sometimes my aim anyway. So yes, there is, I think, a tension, but I think it's mostly the way that I feel about it and how I'm gonna approach that. I think the second question might have been, I might not have explained myself properly. This was about the Grace who was abused when she was domestic servant. I think she wasn't abused in a place for victims. She was abused in a place where she was abused while she was being held as a domestic servant.
Right. Okay. I heard the phrase home and I sort of thought shelter.
Yeah, in the home where she was. Yeah, sorry, not the home. I'm sure that goes on, though. I just haven't done research in that. So that was about the domestic servitude. The question about external pressures, I guess, speaks more widely to criminological research about rational behaviours, and whether we can try to understand the reasons why people commit crimes, particularly ones that are perceived as serious and harmful. You know, we find it more difficult to see that, and we find it more difficult. People find it more difficult to understand why women would be involved in that. And somebody very nicely quoted my article that where the Crown prosecution woman that I interviewed said, it's such a vile and violent thing. I can't believe that women are involved in it. As if it's okay for men to do it, but we have to think about why women do it even more. And I think, again, there is a spectrum of this. I think some people are very rational in their approach and know the harm that they're causing and don't care. But even then, when you dig behind that, you can see these problems in very early life where things like social care should have perhaps intervened in a 13-year-old taking crack. You would hope that there would be some help for that. But also, it's not an excuse and a justification, but it's about, you know, we can't say, oh, well, that's all right then. I mean, that person clearly still needs some sort of sentence. But I think there's then a process of saying, okay, how is that person not going to do it again? And that, I think, is a really big challenge, particularly when we're working across transnational borders, because in sentence planning, in criminal justice, if the person was from the UK, we would sit down with them and talk about what we're going to do to try and help their desistance and support them, whether that might be to do with drug use or finances or employment. But when the person's going to be deported, it's almost, well, it's not our problem. The sentence planning is not there. They're going to go home to a different probation system and perhaps have no intervention and go back to the criminal family that they offended with in the first place. A lot of the people that I've spoken to who are quite entrenched in their criminality, when we've talked about future plans, have said, I'm going to go back and do the same thing I've been doing. You know, I'm going to go back and be a pimp, but I'm not going to come back here. So I guess as a measure of success, if you were, I don't know, the police or the Home Office, you might go, oh, good, that's a good result. They're not coming back here. But I think we need to have a wider responsibility a wider responsibility than that. And I think the reason for me of identifying the pressures that people are under is to try and look for ways to intervene, which is incredibly difficult, like any desistance. But I think it makes it worthwhile speaking to them.
Thank you so much. Those are really, really interesting answers. I won't continue back and forth. I think we should move on. There's quite a lot of questions coming through, so I'll maybe just jump on to the next one straight away. So Maya has a question. She's asked, in the victim context, trafficking and smuggling often get mixed up, and she wonders whether this is the case in the perpetrator context as well. So do perpetrators get charged with the correct offence, and do they see themselves in one category or the other?
Yeah, definitely. We've interviewed people who are convicted for smuggling, who would have met the definition of traffickers. How they see themselves. I mean, there is the pipeline for modern slavery convictions is between 2 and 4%. It's worse than rape. So when we look at offences to arrests to charges to, if the final number is between 2 and 4%, which is really, really low. That's not to say they're not convicted of something else. They might be convicted of a more serious offence, but you can't track that information. It's really difficult with the way that our criminal justice data is set up to track a person through the criminal justice system. The Magistrates Court and the Crown Court are going to produce some data later in the year around that, so that'll be interesting. But that still would need to be joined up with police data prior to that to understand entirely the route. So we'll see how good that is, but there's definitely work to be done around sentencing, because there's a process, a bargaining process in the court system where somebody might say, if your client pleads to an assault or a smuggling offence or something, then we'll not have to go to trial, which protects the victim from having that quite traumatic experience. So people do end up getting charged, getting convicted with something that doesn't quite reflect what they've done. How they see themselves is quite similar to how some victims see them, who somebody mentioned earlier on, that they often see them as quite helpful. They help them to travel and they help them to get a job. Not all of them, but some of them, and quite a few of the people that we interviewed, maybe a third, brought letters with them from people who'd written to them, from victims saying, I don't want to support this prosecution. I'm really sorry that this has happened. Whether or not they were forced to write those is interesting. I mean, the fact that they brought them to us is sort of an interesting transaction of how they see themselves. Some of them felt bad about what they'd done. Some of them felt guilty that people had been hurt. But so to answer the question, yes, they do get mixed up and they don't get convicted for the right offence for lots of reasons.
Brilliant, thank you so much. You've reminded me of plea bargaining. I don't know if plea bargaining is allowed in Northern Ireland. I'm going to check, but it's interesting that it still happens.
But it happens.
Yeah, something to think about. I'll move on to Gillian's question, which is a kind of a broader one about whether there are any main tools, I suppose, from the world of criminology that you think would be useful for the broader research community in human trafficking to know about.
I suppose a bit like the conversation we just had, I think some of the qualitative research that's available from conversations shows, and this came up in the presentations earlier, I think on the one hand, this is the legal framework, but on the other hand, this is what everyday police officers experience, this is what everyday CPS prosecutors experience, probation officers, victims and offenders, and to see the kind of issues in the interpretation of that framework. I think having the conversations between, from a legal perspective, this is what we've got, but what's happening, what are people actually doing with that? Because I think Josh was talking earlier about how lots of NGOs will, and this is the same in my experience, will find loopholes and try and find their way around legal frameworks in order to better assist and support victims where they can. And that can be the case in all kinds of different places. So we do a lot of work with local sex worker support organisation, and again, you know, the things that they tell us from just meetings and conversations and updates, I think thinking about them in terms of the legal framework, because the legal frameworks just look so rigid, but the way that that's interpreted, I think, is an interesting thing to think about, and vice versa. You know, I think being able to go back and say, this is what they're supposed to be doing, and this is what they are doing. How do those two things go together? Which I'm hoping is a little bit what I'm going to see doing the Parliament research versus the offenders.
Thank you so much. There's a nice link actually there with Laura's question, because she begins by sort of expressing appreciation for the fact that you do look at the discourse surrounding people who are criminalised and kind of problematise perspectives which just brand them as evil, for example. And she says she appreciates your take because it encourages people to look at the structural issues, which I certainly agree with. But then to link into what you just said, she asked about how your research has been received by the policy community. I mean, I know you've said you haven't conducted any interviews with parliamentarians yet, but have you any experience of having those discussions? It ties in with what I was thinking earlier. I suppose I'm wondering how a Conservative politician will react to your stories about the lived experiences of criminals involved in human trafficking.
Yeah, I haven't spoken to any of them yet. I have. So we have a steering group for the project, and on the steering group there is police and probation, but they're receptive anyway. The Home Office, Anti-Slavery Commissioner's Office, that's the main people that are on it. So we've presented a lot with them, and then we've got some NGOs as well, actually, which is really important because having a link with victim-focused organisations. I think if you do perpetrator work, and then my background being in probation, you can lose sight sometimes of the victim, and we were really conscious that we didn't want to do that through the project. So we've done a lot of presenting to them, and people are, you know, the police are receptive to us saying this is the person's experience. We are lucky well, I think we are. We spend probably about 3 hours with each person. We interview them twice, and they're quite long interviews, and it's a lot longer than probation get to spend with them. You know, we probably get more information, and they're not as guarded because we haven't got any agenda other than listening to their stories. I did a presentation for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association lately about the research, and they were receptive as well. I think thinking about actually my very first story about when I started out, and I think the context has changed quite a lot. I think there would, had I been trying, well, I was trying to do this then, but nobody wanted to do that. But I think I haven't, yeah, even in victim groups, when you present, this is some of the people that we've spoken to, they're the same stories that they hear, because the woman that we work with with the sex worker support organisation, the women tell her story, like, he was really helpful, you know, he bought my ticket, he came over, he wasn't that bad until such a thing happened. So they know that there is a nuance to people that's different from, you know, the evil trafficker that we see in the paper. That's not to say they don't exist, you know, clearly there are really violent and exploitative people. But, you know, I know, and similarly, the women that I've interviewed, Yeah, people seem more receptive as well to hear the women's stories, which again is interesting and something that we can reflect on as it goes on. But specific stories of victimization, and there are stories in there that we've just finished a book chapter around child sexual exploitation and grooming, which is perhaps the most difficult to listen to people's stories. Perhaps less receptivity to their lived experiences. But again, I think we still have to engage with those lived experiences. We don't perhaps have to sympathise with them, but we do have to look and say, how could that have been stopped? Even though the stories are difficult to hear.
Thanks again. I suppose aside from how to stop it, I think Josh's question is about peering into the minds of the people involved once it's happened. So he asks about people who are convicted of modern slavery and whether you have any views on what they think justice is. So I both quote perpetrators and victims. I think I understand what he's getting at. If you're convicted and labelled a perpetrator of modern slavery, that obviously has connotations and stigma and consequences. But in light of what you've been talking about, I suppose it maybe conceals some of the personal victimisation that led them to participate in those activities. So what does that tell us about justice and about how we frame it?
Yeah, and I think a lot of the people that we've spoken to, some of the people that we've spoken to are in the middle of appeals for various reasons. And I can at some point search for those with using their real names and find out whether they were successful in their appeal and what happened. So in terms of justice, they perceive that there has been an injustice because they say, some of them have said that the victims have made up some of the evidence. One of them particularly said that they were victimised, they were hounded by the police who were trying to get them for anything, and this would do, because there was a big focus on modern slavery at the time. So it was that they said that the department needed to have a success story and that they were targeted on purpose. So some of them feel a great injustice, and a lot of them feel an injustice because the person that they were doing the offence with wasn't convicted. And they perhaps, one of the women that I interviewed was convicted for trafficking for sham marriage. So she would recruit African women from Portugal, from a diaspora in Portugal. So they were EU women who were African EU women in this diaspora. They were from Cape Verde, and the person that she offended with would recruit men from Nigeria, and then they would get married in the UK. And she got a little bit of money, and the woman who got married got a little bit of money, and the man got a visa. And the man who organised it got most of the money, but he didn't get convicted because she told them who he was. He'd given her a fake name and they just never found him. And she was quite vulnerable. She was more vulnerable than him probably, but he escaped. And there are a few stories of both men and women who said, well, the person that set it up for me, they seem to just disappear. So they feel an injustice, not because they didn't do it, but because they sort of, the other person that got them involved in it escaped, didn't get punished for it. In terms of justice for victims, I'm not an expert at all in victims, but the 5 women that I've interviewed who are victims of modern slavery in prison, really, I mean, that is a significant problem of foreign national women, maybe men, but women in prison, that the prisoner actually identified and wanted me to interview because they wanted to look at ways that they could help them. But it seems to me that once you're criminalised, that kind of trumps the victimisation status, and it's so difficult then to get support in the criminal justice system. to make an NRM referral. You know, I followed up on all these people with police contacts and NGO contacts that I've got, but despite there being this, you know, 230 NGOs, trying to find one that's got the resources to go into prison is really difficult. And it seems likely that those women will just be deported because they're criminals for immigration offences, not for the ones that I've interviewed, not even for, I mean, the immigration is a proper offence, but the reason that they were here is because they've been trafficked in the first place. So I think that's a massive problem and a massive injustice at the moment.
It opens an interesting question about, which I'd love to know more about hierarchies, doesn't it? About hierarchies of perpetrators and hierarchies of victims. Mm. So everything you've discussed there now, I was trying to work out in my own mind, where would I assign blame, or how would I assign blame? Would I do it in portions? Do I think about it in joint liability terms? It's something I think that I haven't thought about enough anyway. And it links into Danielle's question, because she's asked about the conception of women, I suppose, who have a complex story, who have engaged in trafficking behaviour, but have also themselves been trafficked or exploited in some other way. And her question is, does your research show that they're perhaps more likely to be viewed as purely traffickers? So maybe the kind of victimised parts of their story are forgotten or sidelined more than if they're not women? I think I'm presenting Danielle's question, right?
Yeah, I'm just reading it as well. I don't know about more likely. And obviously we're engaged in interviews rather than, we haven't got lots and lots of data. So I understand the question. It's difficult to say this is what's happening to lots of people. I think women in prison anyway have got multiple complex victimization across the whole of the women's estate. If the women's prison the 4% of our prison population that are women have got many more victimization experiences than the men. They're much more likely to be victims of child abuse and domestic abuse. So these women in some ways are no different from the rest of the women that are in prison. They've not got different problems. They're the same as all of the other people. I think the worstness of some of it is that they were engaged in sexual exploitation of other women. I think that's the kind of judgment that some people find difficult to square away, where they can say, oh, well, of course a man's going to sexually exploit a woman, that's normal. But a woman to do that, that's very bad. And it goes, you know, right back to criminological research about women are mad, bad or sad. You know, there's something wrong with them if they're going to engage in criminal behaviour. I think a point of this, and also a point of for what you were just saying, Connor, is that there is a defence, this Section 45 defence against being criminalised for an offence that you've committed whilst being exploited. And the way that that's been used is they're struggling a bit with the way that it's used, because there's a line, I think, at which if the offence is very serious, it becomes then in the public interest to prosecute that offence, even if it was done under exploitation. If it was shoplifting or something, that's okay. But if it's recruiting someone else into modern slavery, then that's not okay. So it's difficult, I think, in the way that that's being used, and it's very tied into the forced drug dealing, the county lines narrative that's going on at the moment. So I think some of those things play into some of this, but I also think that what I said before about there needs to be a better understanding of the sentencing process and how that impacts, perhaps by gender, perhaps by nationality, and perhaps by ethnicity as well, because certainly for the UK people, there are many more BME groups that we've interviewed than white people. We have only got a small number of people, but again, I think it'd be interesting to look at that in sentencing data.
That's really interesting. It makes me think about how law sometimes gets a bit of a hard name, or a bad name, for being too blunt a tool, and it can be, but I think it's mildly reassuring to hear that there is more nuance than perhaps we think built into the legal framework. So the defence you mentioned, the carefulness with which the probation service seems to conduct its work. I mean, if that part of it's reassuring, although there's obviously an awful lot more research that needs to be done. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so I'm going to have to wrap things up. I really am grateful to you for handling all those questions so brilliantly, and for giving us your lecture.
If anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'm happy if anyone has any questions.
That's wonderful. Okay, well, thank you once again, and thank you everybody for coming along, both to this wonderful keynote and to the symposium more generally. It's been fantastic as far as I'm concerned, and a real triumph in terms of the organisers, the postgraduate students from all 3 institutions involved. So a huge well done to them. I think I'll leave it there and just wish you all a nice evening. Thank you so much.